Hearns broke his hand on Wilfred Benitez's head on December of 1982, and the hand remained in a cast until April 1983. Hearns didn't fight until July 1983 when he decisioned Murray Sutherland, who would become the first super middleweight champion, winning the IBF title. Hearns beat Sutherland on points in Atlantic City. He didn't make his first defense of the WBC junior middleweight title until February 1984 when he outpointed Luigi Mincillo of Italy in Detroit. Hearns had won 6 straight since he lost to Leonard, but he was forced to go the distance 3 times straight. He had barely used the right against Sutherland, and Stewart said he was even afraid to throw it in sparring. The Hitman moniker wasn't really working at this stage, and Hearns began billing himself as the Motor City Cobra. Between fights, he became a virtual recluse. Frederick Lorenz, if that's how you pronounce it, was Hearns' physician in Detroit, but he may have been his psychiatrist. "You have to understand Thomas," Lorenz said to Sports Illustrated. "His whole value judgment is based on how hard he can hit. This man actually lives and exists mentally from the power in his right hand. It's his self-image." Ray Leonard was growing restless in retirement, and his ringside work for CBS and HBO just reminded him how close he was to the sport and how much he missed it. When Leonard asked Mike Trainer to imitate preparations for his comeback, the direction in which he planned to go was self-evident. The first opponent Trainer contacted was Light Hagler, a left-hander, and was approached about fighting in New England. Sean Mannion was a rugged southpaw who also called himself the Galway Gouger. Mannion was a former Irish international amateur champion who had boxed for his entire career in the United States, and by 1984 he was rated number 2 among the junior middleweights by the WBA. The only stipulation was that the guy had to be free of promotional entanglements and in a position to make a deal, said Trainer. "We don't want to be wrangling with any outside promoters over this thing," and I told Mannion's manager, John Connolly, that more than once. Although it was never announced, Ray's older brother Kenny and matchmaker J.D. Brown had undertaken preparations for a new company that would have promoted Leonard's future bouts, including presumably a fight against Hagler, had it occurred in 1984. Entering into a contract with an opponent encumbered by promotional baggage might have complicated that plan. Mannion had been under contract to Top Rank, but the pack had expired with his last fight. Cash-strapped Connolly apparently tried to use the Leonard offer to squeeze Bob Arum. In a phone call, Arum reminded him that he had worked hard to get Mannion into position for a title challenge and warned him that a loss would imperil his number 2 WBA ranking. Connolly and Mannion hopped the shuttle to New York that night and, in exchange for a 10 grand signing bonus, agreed to a contract extension with Top Rank. It was a pretty stupid move on their part, said Trainer. Mannion would have got more money for fighting Ray, $100,000, than he wound up getting to fight Mike McCallum for the title. And even if he lost to Ray, his career would not have suffered. And then when you look what happened in the 2 fights, Mannion probably had a better chance of beating Ray, who was coming off the layoff, than he did McCallum, which was 0. I tell you what, Mike Trainer couldn't have been more correct with what he just said there. I remember McCallum versus Mannion, and Mike's wife, Yvonne, had recently died, and he was just there, single parent with his daughter. And he got $30,000 for the bout, and he was ranked number 1. So don't ask me what Sean Mannion's purse was. But McCallum at the time was one of boxing's best kept secrets, which some people didn't know about. So maybe Arum and Mannion thought, okay, we can get hold of the title, and once we get that, we can look towards fights with Hearns, Duran, Leonard, and etc., etc. But no, that was his last fight. I remember at elite level. McCallum just slapped him around the ring. Took a great shot, Mannion, but he didn't offer nothing more than durability. Totally outboxed. The next and last time I saw Sean Mannion was when he came over here to fight Errol Christie. I can't remember if it was an 8-rounder or a 10-rounder, probably a 10-rounder, and he was just unanimously outboxed again. After Mannion took himself out the picture, Trainer turned to Kevin Howard, a journeyman from Philly, with a record of 20 wins, 4 losses, 1 draw. The bout was scheduled for the 25th of February at the Centrum in Worcester, Massachusetts. But it had to be postponed when Leonard's physical revealed yet another abnormality in his eyes. Massachusetts Boxing Commissioner Tommy Rawson had asked that Leonard be examined 2 weeks before the scheduled bout rather than the more standard 2 days. The detached left retina that had prompted his retirement proved to be fully healed, but in the course of his examination, Dr. Edward Ryan observed some peripheral retina problems, specifically a lesion in the retina of Leonard's right eye. The imperfection was corrected at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary by what Ryan described as prophylactic cryosurgery. The Howard fight was postponed indefinitely, and Leonard flew back to Baltimore after the operation. But in Leonard's absence, Ryan precipitated something of a firestorm when he told the Herald's Tim Horgan, "In no way would I recommend that Sugar Ray Leonard ever fight again." Once the bout was rescheduled for the 11th of May, Leonard's handlers trotted out Dr. Ryan for the Boston press conference, at which the retinal specialist clarified his remarks to Horgan. What he had meant to say, Ryan explained, was that he didn't think anyone, including Leonard, should box at all, whether they had an eye injury or not. And although he was predisposed against the sport on general principles, he allowed that Leonard was probably at no greater risk than any other boxer. After Ryan's address, reporters were informed that Leonard would entertain no further questions about his eyes. A British fight scribe in Worcester came to cover the bout and was moved to observe, "His bloody eye is the only reason we are here." I don't have a license to practice medicine, but if I had to guess, I'd say the eye injury went back to the Marcus Geraldo fight, recalled Leonard years later. Something like that can happen in my sports, because there's trauma involved, but it could have happened playing basketball with my kids. An acquaintance of mine had surgery for 2 detached retinas, and he never boxed in his life. After the February bout had been postponed, Kevin Howard was told to sit tight, but instead agreed to fight Bill Fireball Bradley in Atlantic City on the 25th of February and stopped him in 6. "I needed the fights. I needed the work," explained Howard, who had lost 2 of his previous 3 to Marlon Starling and Mark Medall. Sandwiched between them 2 losses was a win against Richard Nixon. Not the Watergate, Richard Nixon. And had dropped out of both the WBA and WBC rankings. "I knew some people say I took a big risk by taking that fight," said Howard, after arriving in Worcester. "But to me, it wasn't a risk." Some people included Dan Doyle, the promoter for Leonard Howard, who said that had Howard lost to Bradley, we would have had another opponent and Howard would have lost out on the $100,000 he had been promised for fighting Leonard. Leonard, who reportedly engaged in some hellacious sparring with Simon Brown back in Maryland, toyed with a trio of locals at a Worcester gym the day the press was invited to watch him spar. He went around with David Ravello, Keith Stevenson, and Jose Ruiz. Angelo Dundee told Horgan that day that he had been flabbergasted by Leonard's decision to come back. "I was surprised because he's financially set, and he was doing very well at what he was doing after he retired," said Dundee. "But nothing takes the place of being the best at what you do." "He missed the ring," echoed Kevin Howard. "He missed the glory, and he missed the fans. I know I was one of them." Although Leonard never mentioned Hagler's name in the run-up to the fight, it wasn't far from anyone else's lips. A Hagler-Leonard announcement, trainer hinted within a wink, might come sooner than you think, but Dundee urged caution. "After this fight, we'll evaluate Ray's performance and decide what to do next. It's too early to talk Marvin Hagler. We really don't know a thing until Friday night." Hagler seems decidedly unsympathetic when it comes to Ray. "If he's foolish enough to step in the ring with me, then I'm foolish enough to rip his eye out," said Hagler. Dundee had become something of an expert on boxing comebacks, having overseen at least 3 of them by Muhammad Ali. "It's a tougher struggle with a big guy," said Angelo. "Plus Muhammad didn't do nothing while he was away. He just got big and husky and put on weight. How much? I was afraid to even look at the scale. But Ray stayed in shape." Although it was a 10-rounder, a non-title fight, HBO paid $2.5 million to showcase Leonard against Howard. It was Ray's first taste of combat in 27 months, and in the fourth round, Howard caught Leonard and knocked him on his backside, leaving him spread eagled on the ring mat, staring up at the Centrum roof. An embarrassed Leonard made up his mind to retire even before he got up. I was shocked to see myself on the canvas, and I thought, it just wasn't there. Leonard would explain at the post-fight press conference, I knew it wasn't there, and that's when I decided it was time to retire for good. If I didn't feel it tonight, I never will. There's no sense in going on. Leonard regained control after the knockdown and was well on his way to winning when referee Dick Flaherty stopped the bout at 2:28 of the ninth. Although some were critical of Flaherty's stoppage, the referee said that Howard's legs were wobbly and that he would rather stop a fight 5 seconds too soon than 1 second too late. When Howard protested, he only fueled the referee's argument. If they were going to stop the fight, they should have stopped it when he went down. I knocked him down, he got up, he knocked me down, and I got up. In fact, Howard never actually hit the deck, a fact that he was reminded of, and then he just shrugged and murmured, that's regardless. Hagler and the Petronellis had once again been invited to be on hand, and Marvin had fully expected to be called out at the post-fight press conference. Aram had confided that he would have $10 million apiece in the bank for Hagler and Leonard the following week. That side, Marvelous Marvin, is the story of my life. Hagler wasn't the only one who got played that night. Ray also stiffed his sometime employers at Time Warner, allowing them to get beat on what should have been their own story. When HBO's Larry Merchant interviewed Leonard in the ring immediately after the fight, he asked Ray point blank whether he might quit. I'll think it over, Leonard told him. 20 minutes later, Ray walked into a press conference and not only announced his retirement, but also revealed that he had reached a decision midway through the fourth round as he laid on the canvas. I wasn't trying to intentionally mislead Merchant, Leonard recalled. I just wasn't thinking too clearly at the moment. The fight had only been over for a few seconds when he interviewed me. But I'll tell you who was even more disappointed than Marvin. Kevin and JD, added Leonard. If I kept fighting then, they would have been my promoters. They left a lot of money on the table that night. 2 months later, before Leonard fought Howard, Hagler had consummated his often delayed meeting with Juan Domingo Roldan, stopping El Martillo in the 10th round of their title fight at the Riviera. Roldan was credited with a first-round knockdown enraging Hagler, who said he had been tripped. 3 months later, at a meeting held on the eve of the Hearns Duran fight, the Nevada State Athletic Commission levied a $500 fine on the Argentinian for having used an ammonia capsule to revive himself on the stool between rounds in the Hagler fight. The rules are there to be enforced, I wrote, reporting Roldan's punishment. But it says here they are fining the wrong guy. Did you ever try to snap open an ammonia capsule while wearing boxing gloves? Roberto Duran had not fought since his loss to Hagler. With time off to challenge for the middleweight title, nearly a year had elapsed in which Duran had not defended the 154-pound title he had won from Davey Moore, and he found himself under increasing pressure from the WBA. Reluctant to meet the organization's mandatory challenger Mike McCallum, he searched for a big money fight. In the meantime, he was going for his windfall from the Hagler fight in typically profligate fashion. He hired his own orchestra and performed Latino music around Central America. The old entourage got bigger, as did his body. Once again, Duran ballooned up to nearly 200 pounds. After several months of negotiation, a Duran-Hearns bout was made. Although it loomed as a matchup of two reigning junior middleweight champions, it would not be a unification bout because the WBA ruled that its title would become vacant the moment Manos de Piedra stepped into the ring against anyone other than McCallum. Exactly how much the WBA championship was worth without Duran's name attached to it was illustrated when McCallum was left to fight Mannion for the vacant title later that year. The bout went to a purse offer, which was won by Top Rank. Bob Arum's winning bid was $75,000. And in October 1984, he put the fight on the undercard of Hagler's defense against Mustafa Hamsho at Madison Square Garden. The Hearns-Duran fight was originally scheduled for Nassau in the Bahamas. Both fighters had already gone there to train, but promised local backing failed to materialize. The fight was moved to Caesars in Las Vegas, where it was hastily christened Malice at the Palace. Caesars had already constructed another huge temporary stadium in anticipation of the heavyweight unification between WBC champion Larry Holmes and WBA titleist Jerry Coetzee. Since the heavyweight unification fell apart about the time things began to unravel in the Bahamas, it made for a fairly seamless transition from Nassau to Vegas. But there was no way in the world Hearns-Duran was going to fill a 25,000-seat arena. Really? Officially, the bout was a co-promotion of Shelteron, a consortium put together by Hearns, former publicist Shelley Saltman, and Bill Korzerski, a Detroit promoter who had staged many Kronk shows. The chief financial backing came from a Los Angeles automobile dealer named Steve Torb. Torb, a millionaire sportsman who decades later would enter a cult named Imperialism in the Kentucky Derby, would recall his brief flirtation with boxing as the most expensive 6 months of his life. A decade later, Saltman had been in charge of publicity for Evel Knievel's ill-fated attempt to jump the Snake River Canyon, an event Arum had promoted. Incensed by what Saltman wrote about him in a subsequent book, the motorcyclist vented his displeasure with an aluminum baseball bat, breaking Shelley's left arm and wrist in several places. Saltman won a $13 million judgment after the attack, but was unable to collect because Knievel declared bankruptcy. In the end, Hearns was guaranteed $1.8 million, Duran $1.6 million for the bout, which Hearns viewed as a necessary step to force the fight. He truly wanted a matchup against Hagler. "I don't just need to win, I need to be devastating," said Hearns, who had confidently forecast a second-round knockout and never backed off that prediction. Stewart recalls Hearns training for the Duran fight as the best he ever looked in his career. "We had the best preparation in the world," said Stewart. Stewart was named an assistant coach with that year's Olympic team, so many of them trained at the Kronk for the games in Los Angeles. Hearns was sparring Mark Breland every day. He also boxed Frank Tate, Pernell Whitaker, and Steve McCrory. We had those guys from the Olympics, plus Mike McCallum, John Collins, Milton McCrory, and Hill McKenty. They were all sharp, and it must have been one of the best camps in boxing history. Compared to sparring with Mark Breland, Duran was like fighting molasses. A few days before the fight, there was a chance meeting between combatants and their entourages at a bank of elevators at Caesars. I kill you, growled Duran, as he brandished a fist. Manos de Piedra already had his game face on. No mas, replied a laughing Hearns in a Motown-accented Spanish. For some reason, Duran had always seemed very uncomfortable around Tommy, said Stewart. I never fully understood it myself. Once, years earlier, we were out in Vegas when Duran was fighting somebody. We were talking through the casino and came upon Duran, surrounded by a bunch of reporters asking questions. Tommy sneaked up behind him and kind of playfully flicked him in the back of his head with his finger. Duran reeled around with his fists up, and he was going to attack whoever did it. But when he saw it was Tommy, he just put his hands down and walked away, leaving the crowd of people standing there. There was something about Tommy that spooked him, insisted Stewart. He had his number. Duran tried to intimidate Leonard. He tried to intimidate Marvin, but he never tried it with Tommy. He was always very respectful, even humble around Hearns. He just didn't seem comfortable in Tommy's presence. In the days before the bout, Stewart predicted, no one has ever really tried to hurt Duran, but Tommy will. If that sounded like a backhand slap at Hagler, it probably was. Tommy's hand speed is a lot quicker than Marvin, said Stewart, but the biggest difference is that Tommy's a gambler. Hagler had Duran in trouble a couple of times, but he had too much respect for him, and he didn't seize the advantage. Tommy won't worry about getting knocked out. If that happens with him, he'll just throw the dice and take his chances. And he might get hit doing it, added Stewart. These are both real macho street fighters, you know? I can really envision this thing turning into a war. a real toe-to-toe slugfest. After his final workout at the sports pavilion, Hearns peeled off his golden red Kronk singlet and flung it into the crowd. Grown men happily fell upon one another as they dove for the sweaty garment. I described the occasion in the Herald. It might as well have been Bo Derrick's discarded underwear instead of the Detroit boxers that they were fighting over. When Hearns sat down to talk a few minutes later, it was evident that while it was Duran he was fighting, Hagler wasn't far from his thoughts either. I was impressed with Duran in the Hagler fight, said Tommy. I even gave him the decision over Hagler. He dictated the fight. He made Hagler fight the way he wanted to. As a matter of fact, sniffed Hearns, there wasn't too much Hagler brought out that night that I can use against Duran. Duran dictated the fight against Hagler, but he won't dictate this one. He's going to discover that fighting me is a lot tougher than fighting Marvin Hagler. Someone wondered if Tommy might worry that some of what he was saying might find its way back to Hagler. I certainly hope so, Hearns replied with a sly grin. CBS had the rights to the delayed broadcast, and Ray Leonard was on hand to provide the color commentary. I wouldn't bet this fight, said the man who had beaten both contestants. Duran was the toughest fight I ever had, and Hearns had the best jab of anyone I fought. Duran has to take the fight to Hearns, try to slow him down, and mix it up. Hearns can make it easy on himself if he stays outside and boxes, but I think they're both capable of knocking each other out. I expect something significant. A knockout or at least a knockdown by the 5th or 6th round. Hearns said he was glad to have Leonard there because he's a good colour man. Leonard, as it turned out, was not at his ringside microphone for Hearns Duran. 2 days before the bout, Juanita went into labour, and Ray flew back to Maryland just in time for the birth of his son Jarrell. Hearns opened at 2-1, and a day before the fight was bet down to 13-10 man-to-man. More interesting was the fact that the sports books made it 2-1 that the fight would go the distance. Hearns had stopped 30 of his first 32 opponents. Duran had only dispatched 2 of his last 10 opponents, going back to the Montreal fight with Sugar Ray Leonard. The 2 opponents he stopped was Cuevas and Moore. On the way to the morning weigh-in, we ran into Eddie Lopez, gorging himself at the breakfast buffet. Lopez would be fighting unbeaten Manny Stewart-trained heavyweight Tony Tucker on the undercard, but right now he seemed more interested in his bacon and eggs. The only time I'm worried, confirmed Eddie the Animal, is when I'm going to court. The weigh-in was scheduled for 8 a.m., the wee hours of the morning by Vegas standards. On the day of the night, despite the unsocial hour, the sports pavilion was choked with members of their media, Nevada Commission officials, Duran's entourage, and in their gold and red regalia, the entire Kronk boxing team. I just hope you get this good a turnout tonight, somebody told Shelley Saltman. The neophyte promoter responded with a weak grin. 14,824 people turned up, and the Hearns-Duran fight would in the final tally lose over $3 million, believe it or not. Duran weighed in at precisely 154. Hearns was half a pound lighter at 153.5. Carlos Padilla was once again appointed as referee, while the panel of WBC judges was composed of Harry Gibbs, Newton Campos, and Hans Levert. Their services, it turned out, would not be required. At the rules meeting, Sparta requested a waiver of the rule calling for 8-ounce gloves in a 154-pound title fight. Using the 10-ounce gloves that Duran wanted might have also benefited Hearns, in that it would have provided an extra bit of protection for his damaged right hand. But when the request was denied, Stewart proclaimed it as a victory. "We'd rather have a puncher's glove," he said. Stewart expressed confidence that Hearns' hand was fully healed and would hold up in battle. "He hasn't hesitated to cut loose with it in the gym," said Stewart. "But I'm going to make sure I wrap it good anyway." The undercard was a showcase for Stewart's Kronk boxers. Jimmy Paul stopped Alvin Hayes in 6 to win the USBA lightweight title. I remember that bout, man. Alvin Hayes, a really lanky lightweight, and he came out pop-locking and dancing and doing all kind of madness, and Jimmy Paul, who went on to win the IBF title, crushed him. He crushed him. Tony Tucker, he knocked out Eddie the Animal in the 9th round of their fight. No surprise there, Eddie gorging himself on bacon and eggs, And he was never in that great shape, Eddie, was he? Two other Stewart-trained fighters won that night. Junior middleweight Dwayne Thomas, who 2 years later would knock out John the Beast Mugabe to win Hearns' old WBC title. Dwayne stopped Tony Harrison in 8. This is not the same Tony Harrison who fought Jamel Charlo on Saturday. No, it is not. And British middleweight Errol Christie TKO'd Stan White in 5 rounds. Another prelim saw WBA lightweight champion Arturo Frias win a 10-round decision over Jose Torres. In terms of ring accomplishments, Hearns and Duran might have been near equals, but in this fight, more than anything involving the Super 4, size mattered. At 6'1", Hearns was the tallest member of the quartet. Duran at 5'7" was the shortest. More tellingly, the Hitman enjoyed a 13-inch reach advantage, which figured to make it difficult for Duran to even get close to him with a jab. It rapidly became clear that he was quite literally in over his head. "I will use a ladder if I have to," Duran had said. Perhaps he should have brought one along. Tommy's style was always going to be too good for Duran, said Stewart. He mastered fighting shorter guys, where he could utilize his jab and his reach. Physical attributes aside, Stewart also wanted Hearns to get inside Duran's head by intimidating him from the outset. "Whenever I have a fighter going up against a bully, I tell him to bully the bully." Stewart used 2 examples, Lennox Lewis when he took on Mike Tyson and Andrew Gallotta. If you whip on them right away, the bully starts crying. In the first round, Tommy pulled Duran's head and stepped on his feet and threw him down. It was all done on purpose, and it got Duran all fucked up because he was used to being the bully. He never got on track after that. Early in the first, Hearns opened a cut above Duran's left eye with a left uppercut. Cholo, seemingly unhurt, continued to box as he attempted to analyze the task before him. 2 minutes into the round, Hearns' jab had yet to be a factor. Duran decided to move inside, hoping to neutralize the right hand. Lowering his head, he lunged towards Hearns, throwing a right hand. As he did, the next thing he saw was Hearns' right fist, a split second before it crashed against his head. Suddenly, the floor was spinning upwards in Duran's direction. Hearns would say later, "I had him looking for the jab, and then I caught him with a sneak right." Duran bounced up and even managed an embarrassed grin as he took Badia's mandatory 8 count. But the instant the referee turned him loose, Hearns pounced again, this time felling Duran with a hard left hook. Duran got up just before the round ended. The bout might have ended there and then had the bell not intervened, a journalist wrote in the Herald. A wobbly Duran barely made it back to the corner, and when he did, he went to the wrong one. In 81 fights, Duran had been knocked down just twice, both times at the hand of Esteban Dujesus, and that had been 10 years earlier. Now he had been down twice in 3 minutes. As Duran sat there on the stool contemplating what had just occurred, he knew what was coming next. He even pleaded with Sparta not to stop the fight. Stewart always maintained that Duran was a bully, but a very brave bully. He got off the stool and charged at Hearns. Sparta told Duran, "You have to keep your hands up," stating the obvious. Reminded him as he replaced the gum shield. Duran appeared to have regained his senses, as well as his footing, but the recovery was an illusion. He wrestled Hearns into a clinch and actually landed a couple of punches, but the revival would prove short-lived. Hearns said he had to stop himself and regroup. When he got himself together, he backed Duran up with 2 quick jabs and then landed the thunderous right hand to the chin that ended the fight. Duran, knocked out for the first time in his career, was lifted right off his feet and appeared to lose consciousness before he even hit the deck. When he saw Duran plow face first into the ring mat, Luis Sparta struggled through the ropes and into the ring. Padilla didn't even see Sparta's charge from the corner, but Duran was so obviously knocked out that the referee waved the fight off without no count. Rather than waving off the fight, he should have instead rolled Duran on his back so he could retrieve the gum shield. The end came at 1 minute and 7 seconds of the second. The fight lasted longer than the playing of the Panamanian national anthem. A jubilant Hearns trotted happily around the ring, throwing phantom punches at the desert sky. Once he regained consciousness, Duran was lifted to his feet. Cholo looked a little embarrassed, but apart from that, he seemed okay. Hearns walked across the ring to embrace him. and then lifted him off the floor. "I was fighting a legend," Hearns said. "Roberto Duran is probably the greatest fighter I've ever been in the ring with. But the respect I have for Duran, I refuse to take it into the ring with me." Hearns was nearly as relieved that he had been able to use his business hand without injury, and he was pleased by the victory itself. "The hitman had been away for a while," said Hearns. "He's been on vacation, but he's back now. I was able to let the power in my right hand go." He called out Marvin Hagler. He said he wants that to be his next fight. Hearns said he could see Hagler in his mind shaking like leaves on a tree. Duran later said his problem was that I brawled with him and lost my head. That's when I screwed up. My corner told me something after the first round, but I can't remember what it was because I'm still a little dizzy. Damn, I tried to get under those long arms and he knocked me crazy with that right hand. Now, added Duran, I have to go to Panama to see what they think. Duran's return to his homeland would once again demonstrate the fickleness of his countrymen. The military junta that controlled the Panamanian government had recently honored him by putting his face on a postage stamp. When he landed in Panama, after the Hearns fight, Duran was promptly arrested and locked up in a Panamanian jail. Since he was never charged, the cause of his humiliating incarceration was never precisely spelled out. There were rumors that the police were messing with him, and apparently they may have took bets thinking he was going to win, and they locked him up. And they said Duran then became aggressive and abusive, and they locked him up. Marvin Hagler's immediate future was already spoken for. An injury had delayed his rematch against Mustafa Hamsho, but that fight was already on the books for October. But Hearns' convincing defeat of a man whom Hagler had struggled just months earlier made it clear what the next big fight for both men would be.